Have you ever walked into a grocery store or some kind of a store without wearing a mask? You forgot a mask at home and you walk in there and people look at you and they don't have to say anything, but you know what they're saying behind their masks. They're saying something. I'm not sure if it happened to you. It has happened to me. Sometimes I forget things. I don't know if you can believe that or not. But it's kind of the same thing with Jesus. The host didn't have to say anything, but Jesus knew what he was thinking. You see, but the issue for this Pharisee wasn't health and safety. It was something way deeper than this. It wasn't even good manners, I should say. The issue was following the law. Following the law, maintaining this image of purity. That's what was important to the Pharisee. And of course, for us to understand that, all you have to do is just do a quick search on your Bible or an app or your computer for washing hands in the Bible. And you may be surprised that you'll find all sorts of references for washing the hands in the Bible. This is actually a big thing for Judaism even before COVID-19. Go figure. And of course, as I was preparing this message, I thought, this actually brings to my mind, an important question. A question that I believe we need to reflect on, to give a bit of thought on this. Because you know what? Washing hands is actually a biblical principle. In fact, washing with water is a law requirement given by God to his people. There's all sorts of circumstances and occasions that it's important that we're called to wash our hands as a cleansing. And of course, if you joined us last week, if you were here last week or you watched online, you may remember that I said that Jesus not only followed the law, but he actually fulfilled the law. I don't know if you remember that from Matthew 5. Yet here we are today, and on this passage which we are reflecting on, we find Jesus not following the law of washing hands. And of course, as we look through the Gospels, we see various occasions where the disciples were accused of the same thing because they weren't washing their hands before a meal. So my question is, what gives? What's going on here? Because it is important for us to think about this. How can Jesus fulfill the whole law and embody perfect obedience when he seemingly, in this passage, ignores the law? Or like we saw last week, and I love that one, flips over tables in the temple. The question is, did Jesus just pick and choose? My shoelaces undone. I hope I don't fall today. That would be the funniest thing if it happens. Does Jesus pick and choose the law? Does he, I like this verse, so I'm going to follow it. But this one, it's kind of inconvenient. I don't quite like it, so I will ignore it. Is that the way that Jesus follows the law? Or maybe for some, that's the conclusion they arrive at when they read the Bible, not considering the context and the unique function of the sacred text. Some people think that, and in fact, they live like that. See, some forget that the Bible is not just one book that we have today, but it is a library. It is a collection of God-inspired books written over a span of 2,000 years by 40 different people, authors, all inspired by God, of course. See, this book we hold today, in our Bibles, we find all sorts of styles and library types. Or I should say literary types. That's what I meant to say. We find narratives, we find biographies, epistles, which are letters to individuals and to churches and groups. We find laments, wisdom, poetry, prophecy. And finally, we find the law. And this, of course, is the issue that Jesus was contending with. The law, The law is full of amazing stuff. It defines legal codes and covenant agreements of God with his people. See, yet though, the law as recorded in our Bibles includes various functions, categories, and purposes that we need to consider. We need to understand. And sometimes we don't. Of course, some of these laws are universal. Think about it as the Ten Commandments. This is for everyone. There's more, of course, but Ten Commandments, universal laws. Some other laws are religious and spiritual in nature. Those are for all sorts of different people. Others are ceremonial and civil laws, applicable to the temple, to the sacrificial system, and to the nation of Israel. And those maybe don't apply to everyone the same way. And of course, there's a lot more I can say about this, and I hope I can do some time. But for today, here's the point. The point is this: the law isn't a uniform series of rules that must be followed all the time by everyone in the same way. See, instead of a blanket statement that serves to bring about judgment, the law is meant to point out to our inability to please God. And the law always points to Jesus, the perfect one. See, James in his chapter 2, verse 10 points out, whoever keeps the whole law, but yet fails in one point, is guilty of the whole law. Do you get this? You keep the whole thing, but then you miss this one little thing, you're guilty of it all. Friends, that's all of us. That's all of us. We need to understand that. We need to live from that basic understanding, for that foundation, that by ourselves we cannot fulfill the law. We're all in this together. And so the Apostle Paul later clarifies the purpose of the law as he writes to the Galatians in chapter 3, verse 24, when he says, the law is our tutor, he calls it. Some other versions say schoolmaster, the teacher which brings us to Christ so that we might be justified through faith. Now that brings it all together. But sometimes we forget that. You see, friends, as Jesus ignores the law of washing hands, he's not breaking any spiritual or universal laws. He's making a big, important point here. And that is that the law is not about external practices. It's the inside that counts. It's the inside that counts. Jesus, on this passage, on this narrative, addresses this as he says in verse 39 and 40, you Pharisees clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. You foolish people. Did not the one who made the outside made the inside also? I'm not sure how many of you have a dishwasher. The other day I was kind of in a rush. So it was night. In the morning, I wanted all the dishes ready. So I just loaded as much as I could on that dishwasher, right? Kathy says to me, no, it's supposed to be in this order, and the forks here and the plates here. And I just, I don't want to wash any dishes by hand, so it's all have to fit. So I put it in there, put the soap, close the machine, press, start, and went to sleep. And then next morning, I want to make my coffee, of course. First thing I do, it's very important. You always know priorities. It's not true. But okay, I grabbed my coffee cup and I looked at it. It looked beautiful, sparkling clean. And just before I poured the coffee inside, thank God I looked inside the cup. And it was full of gunk. Full of gunk. It was whatever it was from before, it was still in there. I'm not sure if you ever experienced that. It's a gross thing. You may be thinking, Paulo, what an awful comparison that you bring here to church today. It is gross for sure. You know what? But that is the very comparison that Jesus used when he was talking about the religious system, and in particular, the Pharisees. He was making the point that the law can make people look clean on the outside, but the law cannot wash dirt, greed, the wickedness on the inside. Jesus, speaking to the Pharisees, says, you're so fixated on the little things. You're so concerned with the little things, even giving a tenth of the sales of your plants of the garden. Yet, listen to this, you neglect justice and the love of God. You're so invested in the small things, so concerned with the little things, yet, big word here, yet you neglect justice and the love of God. Verse 42, mark that down. See, we need to notice what is important to Jesus. What is important to Jesus? And as we reflect on this, we notice that it is not following the law, but it is justice and the love of God. According to Jesus, on this passage, the law is only helpful if it is based on and practiced justly, meaning fairly, with integrity, and lovingly, with the love of God. Jesus is not saying that we shouldn't give our tithes or ignore the law. He's not advocating for a lawless society, but instead he's saying that whatever we do, should come from a deep desire from inside of us to stand up for justice, fairness, and love. In this, friends, we find a challenge for the Pharisees, and maybe the challenge for some of us. Maybe that challenge is for us too. That instead of being the enforcers of the law, we are called to fairness. We are called to standing up for justice, for supporting those who suffer. In this way, we are acting out God's love. That, friends, is the call to the Pharisees. That's the call for Israel, and that is our call today. Yet, as we noticed, and as we know the whole story, instead of this fairness and love that Jesus was calling people into, what was happening in those days, and sometimes, sadly to say, even today, they had created a dualistic system. Dual means two different ways. This system would extend grace to the religious and would offer judgment to those on the outside. See, two different sides. We can see this because the Pharisees were more concerned with what people thought about them, how they were perceived by their community. They craved the respect of people. They wanted to feel more important than all the other people. Jesus talks about that, and he says, you guys want to have the best seats in the synagogue, and when you go to the marketplaces, you want people to address you by your titles. We can notice here there's the false sense of self-worth and importance. If it was today, they probably would be hosting not only fancy dinners, but those formal dinners full of pomp and ceremony. Yet, as we know, this did not impress Jesus then, and certainly does not impress God today. Their law-keeping, their social, cultural rules, their high standards, all those things that they offered, their external righteousness, put in quotes here, all put together did not amount to more than gunk left on the inside of the cup in a poor attempt of washing dishes. See, but it's worse than that. Because Jesus gives us another example. Another example. He says in verse 44, you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing. And if you're like me, it's like, well, I got the cup thing right away. I know what that means. But what's unmarked graves? What does that have to do with it? To most of us, this is kind of an ambiguous illustration. But I must assure you that for the experts of the law, they knew exactly what Jesus was saying. In fact, as Brian read earlier, they got upset. They felt this was an insult to them, as we see this in verse 45. Why is that? Well, according to the law, any contact, even close contact with a dead body, would make them unclean. Clean. For the Jews, if you were close to a seminary, jeez. Could be too, but okay, so let's start again. For the Jews, if you're close to a cemetery, you want to make sure you know where the dead bodies are laying. So they had that all marked down so they could kind of walk around. They didn't want to be defiled, it was the right term. So Jesus was saying to them, despite the religious leaders' external pious appearance, they had not only polluted hearts on the inside, but worse. They were infecting the very people they were supposed to be helping. Why is that? Because they were defiling themselves, and in the process, by proximity, were defiling the people around them. And that's big, friends. That's worrisome. Sometimes we, like the religious leaders, if we're not careful, we do the same thing. If we're not careful, we can discourage people's journey of faith. We can create barriers to their faith journey. We've seen that time and time again. By doing what? By doing the very same thing that the religious leaders were doing, which was placing their expectations on others. Saying, you have to live like me. You have to do like me. Even though, of course, we know that often what they were saying and what they were doing was totally different things. But that's another story. But I believe it makes us think. It should make us think. Because I believe it is important, especially during Lent, as Christians worldwide are focusing on spiritual practices. Practices of prayer, fasting, generosity, that we evaluate our motivations. So today we ask ourselves, what's in the inside? What's our motivation? Those are good questions. What drives our practices, our words, our actions, especially during this Lent, when many of us are doing something specifically just because of Lent? What drives us? What drives us? I'd say that as we look at the words of Jesus, he makes it clear. He makes it clear that our motivation should be a deep desire for justice, which is driven by love. And those two have to go together. Justice driven by love. Don't just get my words. Those are the words of Jesus. But those are not new words. The prophet Micah in chapter 6, verse 8, in an amazing, amazing verse, says this, or asks this. What's good? And what does the Lord require of us? What does the Lord require of us today here at Grace Bible Chapel or at home? What is it? His answer is this: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. What is the requirement for us? To act justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. Friends, those are good words. But sometimes they kind of become good words that we forget. It certainly had happened like this to the religious leaders. They had forgotten about that, and instead they were focused on their external appearance. And they got stuck on their external actions, outward actions. And those things can make us look religious, can make us look godly and even righteous. But deep inside, those things often don't really help. Often they don't reflect God's justice, much less His love. It's amazing love that He has for us. I like to say for all of us, as we journey in life together, as we journey together as a church, as we are together, but more so especially on this time of Lent, that we have a great season, a great opportunity for reflection, resolve, and redemption. It's so good to notice that the main practices of Lent are actually based on justice and love together. During Lent, we reflect and resolve to realign ourselves justly and lovingly toward God. Toward God as we devote ourselves to prayer and meditation on His Word. Friends, I call you to, during this season, as we prepare ourselves to the suffering of Jesus, that we take the time to reflect, to pray, to meditate on God's Word. But then Lent also tells us to continuing focusing or towards self, but not on the way that you think. Instead of amassing more, focusing on ourselves, the reverse happens. It's about ridding ourselves of our excess, the surplus. And that's why sometimes people fast, as in not eating a particular food or a particular drink or whatever you're doing. We understand that is not the end all of our existence. Instead, we focus on the meditation and prayer. But then there's another side of Lent, which is as we focus toward others, our neighbors, and we act in generosity. We give, we are generous, we support one another. We align ourselves justly and toward God and toward others. So friends, as we go today, let's remember not to be so stuck on the little things. For some of us, this is our natural tendency. So if that's you, ease off a little bit. Don't be so uptight if someone doesn't quite live up to your expectations. Allow some time for growth. Allow some time. The thing is, it's very important for us to understand this. If we look around, if we look anywhere for something hard enough, you'll find it. Think about this. If you're looking for something hard enough in anyone, you'll find it. That may be a great thing, or that may be a bad thing. See, the religious leaders looked hard enough at Jesus, and they were able to point the finger at Jesus, wrongly, of course, and they accused him, and they crucified him. Jesus, the perfect one. So this Lent, instead of doing that, instead of going into those practices that end up being very negative, let's embrace God's justice, because He is just. Let's experience His amazing love. First for ourselves. We need that ourselves. We need to understand that God is both just towards us and loving. His grace is amazing. That is step one. But once we experience this, we need to do something else. Because if we just do the first part, we're being just like the religious leaders, right? Oh, let me accept God's grace and God's love and God's justice. But then if we don't give it to others, if we don't share it with others the same way we've received it, we're being like the Pharisees. And we don't want to do that. So today I call you to accept that amazing love of God, to allow His love and justice actually to empower and guide our spiritual journey as a people, as families here represented and at home, as a church gathered, and as a community. Together, may we journey with Jesus. May we journey, may we take our steps, follow his steps to the cross, follow him to his tomb, and then experience his redemption as we witness his resurrection. May God bless you and keep you. It's nice to see you again. God bless you.